The Guyanese government is literally ready to write checks to people. If you have a specific skill or trade that you're knowledgeable in, just say, hey, I can do this. I know how to build homes, or I know how to build bridges, and you're going to get connected very quickly.
Because there's demand. Last year, it's projected to be the fastest growing economy in the world. If you were to ask the average person on the street, what's the fastest growing economy in the world? They're not going to say Guyana. There's going to be a massive boom in construction to support the expats that are going to be coming down to Guyana. They've got these large corporations that are paying them a lot of money to be down there.
Guyana will be the #1 region for ExxonMobil when it comes to the amount of oil that they're producing. And the U.S. is going to ensure that they're also protected from any other nations, such as Venezuela.
Welcome to episode 1 of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name's Austin Bronner. If you don't know me, I'm an entrepreneur, a marketer, a traveler, and I love to get out there to explore and to do business. My co-host is Cody Shirk here. Cody is an investor, a writer, a killer surfer. He's a former firefighter turned financier who has been writing about unique investing opportunities all around the world. That's how I initially found Cody. Was reading his newsletter, The Explorer Report. He's also led trips all over the world, and we met in person for the first time in Guyana a couple months ago. Kicked around this idea of starting a podcast to talk about some of the stuff that we're interested in. And this is episode 1.
Interesting first date, right?
Talk about interesting first. Exactly. Guyana.
Like the most... I don't even think most people know where that is.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, I feel like you get to know each other really well when you travel down to a place that is, most people think is in Africa. So we met. This is the first episode. It's an experiment. We're going to talk about things that are happening in the world that are often overlooked. We're going to talk about business opportunities, adventure, and today we're going to talk about Guyana and what is going on down there. So, yeah, let's kick it off, Cody.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's jump into it.
Guyana.
Yeah. So
what's going on down there?
Yeah. So I actually started first writing about Guyana in 2019.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the first to it, but they had a major oil discovery in 2015. There have been multiple oil companies down there poking around offshore of Guyana. They finally struck it rich in 2015. They weren't actually pumping oil. They were just drilling and doing exploratory wells. And then over the next several years, they just kept finding more and more and more. And as recently as, I think 2 weeks ago, they just found another one. So this is going on for 10 years now. But it's thought of as one of the largest oil discoveries of the 21st century. And it changes everything. Well, it changes everything for Guyana.
Yeah.
But it changes everything for the OPEC world, for the U.S. because it's close to the U.S., for South America, and also the development of the region. So the oil discovery is obviously the most obvious thing going on.
Yep.
But there's so many trickle-down effects that are taking place right now, and that's what we went down to explore.
So first we got to talk about where is Guyana, right? Because you mentioned it, like most people don't know where Guyana was. I didn't know where Guyana was until late last year. Guyana is right next to Venezuela, and it's a direct flight from Miami, about 4.5 hours. It's directly to the east of Venezuela, right on the border, which we'll talk about the dispute. And if you do know about Guyana, you might know about it because of Venezuela and what's going on, which we'll dive into. Right next to it, right? 4.5 hours from Miami, 6-hour flight from Houston. So this oil discovery, what's so interesting about it is it's one of the largest oil discoveries in history, and it's right on the doorstep, effectively, of the United States. Which, if you think about where all the oil has been discovered in the last 100 years, most of the places have been in the Middle East, all these different spots. So this is very, 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 very unique. And things are changing super quickly. So what is it like? What initially, once they discovered oil, drew you into learning more about Guyana?
Yeah, I'll be honest. The first thing was not necessarily the oil. For me, it was like Guyana. I'm would consider myself pretty well traveled, and this is a country that I've never really done much research about, let alone had a reason to go there.
Yeah.
And then knowing that, hey, there's this major discovery and there's going to be this transformation of a country that, by the way, has less than 800,000, just about 800,000 people living in the country. So it's a tiny country population-wise. Land size, it's about the size of the UK.
Yeah.
But if you are pumping that much oil out of the ground, there is going to be a boom there. And as you mentioned, we're most familiar with what happened in the Middle East, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, all these countries that went from nothing to literally financial hubs with obscene amounts of wealth. And it's hard not to think that the same thing could happen down there. So for me, looking at that, I said, I got to get down there.
Yeah.
At least I want to start writing about it. I want to start getting the research down, figuring out what's going on. And then for me, I've had an affinity for Latin America for a long time. And Guyana is the only country in South America that speaks English. I speak all right Spanish, but the fact that they speak English is like, great, let's go. This is going to be easy to navigate. We'll get into it a little bit. Not so easy to navigate, but the English or the language barrier is certainly not a major problem. So, yeah, that was my first inkling to the country is that, hey, let's go check this out. It's going to boom.
And it is booming. Like, the thing that's interesting is it's the world's fastest growing economy by percentage. And that's really interesting because if you were to ask the average person on the street, what's the fastest growing economy in the world? 99 out of 100 they're not going to say Guyana.
Yep.
And that shocked me. That was one of the first things I was like, wow, this has been not only the fastest growing economy in the world last year, it's projected to be the fastest growing economy in the world this upcoming year. And it's been like that for the last 3 years.
Yeah. And to put it into perspective, in 2020, so just before the pandemic, the average income of the country was just under $10,000 per person. Right now, 2024, they're just about to hit $40,000 per person, which is literally 4 times the amount of wealth per person in the span of 4 years. You have an amount of wealth, obviously, that's expanding the population, but what are they spending it on? Education, clothes, transportation, all kinds of different stuff that's going to help develop that society. And what happens next is really anyone's guess, but it's exciting to let your mind wander and figure out what's the next step, and more exciting to get involved in it.
Totally. And so today's episode, like what we really want to get into is we want to talk about, we went down to Guyana, spent some time down there, met with some of the big players that are in Guyana doing things, learned a lot about it, right? We had this idea of what was happening in Guyana, what we read, and then we went down there and we had a different experience. We want to share a little bit about that. And also, like, again, we talked about oil, and one of the things that is interesting is this oil boom. But what the oil boom, where oil is discovered, money flows, right? And the second order consequences of the oil discovery really were the most interesting things for me. And we're going to talk about some of the opportunities and things that we saw down there. And so hopefully you can walk away from this episode with some ideas of like how to get involved, right? And again, back to your point, one of the craziest things that I read is that per capita, they have 3 times as much oil as Saudi Arabia. So when you think about the average person and this wealth boom from 20,000 to 40,000, they've got 3 times as much oil per capita as Saudi Arabia. So you can imagine the standard of living and the change that's going to happen across the board in the economy. So let's dive in here. And I'm interested. So again, I started reading your writing, got connected with you, and then we went down there. What was your like expectation going into that trip?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think anybody travels to a new city, new country, or even, hey, I'm going to go visit my neighbor's house or whatever. You have this expectation.
Yeah.
And oftentimes you walk in and say, whoa, pleasantly surprised or shocked or whatever. So for me, I thought, okay, this is clearly an oil play here. I'm not like an oil guy necessarily. So I can go learn about it, but I don't know how I'm going to get involved here. So that was my thought going in.
Yeah.
What happened, and what is obvious in hindsight, is that when we were there, we saw that the oil players not only were established, they were essentially, let's say, walled off. Everything that they have developed is set in stone. They've got their system going on. They've got their subcontractors. They've got the infrastructure for their operation going on. But the supporting industries, like our ride from the airport to the main city, atrocious. Like it's
Totally.
So underdeveloped.
You arrive at this. I would just put it as like a first world airport, kind of like it's the same airport that is everywhere. You go in, there's marble. You land, it's all white overhead lighting. You're like, I could be anywhere.
Big picture of the president welcoming.
Big picture of the president.
Great.
Business conferences everywhere. Pretty seamless to get through. And then what happens? You walk out, and it feels, for me, it felt like I was in India.
Yep.
And you've got 200 people all, hey, I'll give you a ride. I'll give you a ride. Holding signs, trying to convince you to get into their car. And you're like, okay.
And the important thing to note is that their flights land near midnight.
Yeah.
Because the road from the airport to the capital, Georgetown, is so underdeveloped that they can't have traffic during the day. They need to keep it open for their regular commerce. So they schedule all the flights to land late at night so the tourists can use the highway when no one else is using it. So the drive from the airport, after you got everybody yelling at you, pulling at your shirt, take my car, this car, whatever. We had transportation set up for us, luckily. But that road was a solid hour at 1 a.m.
Yeah.
It was a 2-lane highway. It was dusty. It was the classic kind of adventure style arrival in a country that you're kind of scared a little bit, but also like, wow, this is the real deal. That was it for Guyana. But go offshore and they're pumping millions and millions of dollars of oil out of the ground every day. So what's the disconnect here? And that's what, we think is the big opportunity here, all these different things. So transportation was the most obvious thing for me that, hey, this is something that is completely underdeveloped. The second thing, just because it was the second order of what we experienced, was their hotels. There is literally one chain hotel in the entire country. And it's a Marriott. Yeah. It's one Marriott, and it's on the coast of Georgetown. And it's, when we were there, between $500 and $1,000 per night, US dollars. And the hotel was pretty much booked up. And it wasn't necessarily like a conference weekend or anything.
And it wasn't necessarily a nice Marriott. No. It was a Marriott.
Yeah, it was a...
It was a Marriott in Guyana with a pool, right? Yeah. That was it.
That was it. And the rooms were totally normal.
Yeah.
So we're talking like New York, tier 1 city prices times 2 for, subpar size rooms. So we ended up at this other kind of... It was a hotel, but I would call it maybe like a guest lodge, a local guest lodge. It was clean. I can't complain about it. But that was the only option, was either the Marriott or you're doing these local Guyanese guest lodges. And our check-in, we had a group of people, and it took us way too long. We were up until like 2 or 3 in the morning checking everybody in. They're scanning credit cards and taking down handwritten notes of license or driver's license numbers and passport information. It was just completely underdeveloped. And honestly, everyone was really nice. The experience wasn't horrible. It was just an eye-opener to how far they have to go to develop all the services that support the oil industry there.
Totally. And I think I had a similar viewpoint to you, where I was like, this is going to be really interesting, the place where all the opportunity is going to be is within oil. Then we show up, and it kind of aligns in that way for me, or I'm like, the transportation is like kind of sketch. The hotels are kind of sketch. Oh, probably it's not going to be that developed. And then we end up having meetings with like the CFO of Exxon Guyana, and then another person involved with Exxon Guyana, and you start to talk to people, and you realize, no, that doesn't reflect what's happening at all. They're way more developed there. They figured it out, and so I think when I think about my expectation versus reality, day one on the ground, as we started like walking around the city, it was in some way, it was like in some ways sketchier than I expected, right? And I've traveled all over the world in some of the most sketchy places. I have an incredibly high threshold for what sketchy is, like very, very, very high. Like, yeah. So, and I was like, oh, this is pretty sketchy. This feels pretty sketchy walking around. I don't really want to walk around by myself. It doesn't feel comfortable. And then you also see at the same time this mix between the construction that's happening and in between kind of like almost like shanty areas, right? And so that takes me back to like, I was in India for 3.5 months in like around 2008. And I was like, this feels so similar to where I was in India, where you're seeing the construction and the growth happening, and it's mixed in. And to me, that was the biggest sign in my head of like, okay, we're at a period where this place is about to change significantly. And all the things that take a city from being, maybe like a third world city to a first world city, they're going to happen. It's just a matter of like when and how.
Absolutely. And I will add some numbers there just to give some context to what's going on in Georgetown. So for ExxonMobil, and by the way, ExxonMobil is the number one oil driller there. There's been a number of changes in rights to the drilling rights offshore, but it's pretty convoluted, but it's essentially fallen into ExxonMobil's control.
Majority.
And part of their agreements with the Guyanese government, but also the companies that they bought rights from, was that they would reinvest back into the Guyanese economy. And in 2022 alone, they dumped $400 million into the Guyanese local economy. And maybe in a major country or major city, that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but the town of Georgetown and the country of Guyana literally cannot absorb it. And the reason why is because there isn't the proper companies to take in those funds to actually develop things. So whether it's real estate or importing cars or selling food or building restaurants or whatever it is, they're just not prepared.
Yeah.
So for an entrepreneur that wants to move down there and check things out, I know we'll get to that in a little bit, it's just one of those things you're like, whoa, it's almost too many things that you could attack.
Totally.
And there's these major corporations literally handing out blank checks saying, fix this for us. We need this figured out for our oil employees to live. We need restaurants. We need hotels. We need transportation. We need nightlife. We need a restaurant. We need a bar. And they're ready to pay for it right now. But the only limiting factor is people down there building that stuff. And that's kind of what you're alluding to, is those growing pains. You can just tell it's right on the verge of taking that quantum leap to a kind of backwoods, old style city to maybe a tier one city someday.
Yeah. Tier one, or at least like, the shift from where the juxtaposition between falling down houses and then these brand new, right? And the way that works, it's like, it's not linear. It's like, it's never been in my experience going to different places, traveling all over. It's not linear. It's like some things get built that are they're like tier one, modern, and like a mall gets built, right? You go to places in the Middle East and these oil places, and it's like the most spectacular, ridiculous mall you've ever seen, next to like places that are old, like, that are falling down. That's kind of the way that things develop. But yeah, so back to kind of like what you're seeing, right? So we show up there, check in, we spend the next day walking around. It's like I said, it's a little bit sketch during the day.
It was sketch levels. I agree with that. I'm pretty well traveled.
Yeah.
I feel like I have very good street smarts.
Yeah.
And my street smarts meter was like, it was like getting pinged every couple minutes. You can see those eyes looking at you. You can see people kind of following you. And you're kind of like, all right, I'm going to walk down this street. I'm going to make sure I stay in a group here. I'm going to walk into the store right now because these guys over here have totally checked me out, and they know for a fact that I'm some tourist that doesn't belong here.
I always ask like the people at the hotel, I'm like, okay, you're local here. Like, what if you were in my position, what would you do and what wouldn't you do? And I remember the woman told me, she was like, don't walk that way. She's just like, that whole direction, just don't walk that way. You can walk that way. I was like, okay, great. I'll just trust you on that. So sketch level is kind of high. Then we go into, throughout the day, we kind of check things out. We're spending time in the city. Then we go have some really interesting meetings that night with entrepreneurs in the town, people that are involved in the government, people involved with the American government who are down there as like kind of diplomats. And they talk about like what is going on in Guyana, what are some of the opportunities that we're seeing, and like that's kind of when it started to shift in my mind around, okay, oil's not the big opportunity, it's supporting other things. I think my biggest takeaway from that first night was there's going to be a massive boom in construction to support the expats that are going to be coming down to Guyana. And that was one of the first opportunities that I kind of was clicking in my mind. I'm like, like where there's not many people, again, 800,000 people in this entire country. who's going to be doing the building, right? And that was kind of like the question in my mind as all these big projects that they wanted to get done were being laid out, and they were talking about what the future of Guyana looks like. My first question was like, who's doing the building?
Yep. And I think one really good example of that is we spoke with a specific company that's an import-export company.
Yeah.
And their number one problem right now was, capital for themselves to basically float the import and export expenses, but also there was a big storage yard. They needed a warehouse to basically import the stuff, keep it in the warehouse where it then got, distributed throughout the rest of Guyana.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, let's say construction, maybe it's they're importing a container load of toilets or sinks or shower heads or whatever it is.
Yeah.
In the U.S. and many other countries, it's a non-thought. You don't even think about that. You just go to Home Depot or whatever, you buy this stuff. But there you think, I need to buy a house. And you're like, okay, let's go get the supplies. I'm like, well, where do I go?
Where do I go?
Oh, I got to import it all. And so that's a perfect business opportunity that is, I wouldn't have normally thought about, but it's import-export. We need a nice warehouse to import the stuff off the ship, get the container here, unload the stuff in the warehouse, and then we'll distribute it throughout the city for the next couple of weeks. And that one business alone was very simple, but also I would never thought about it because I was so focused on the oil when we were going down there.
For sure. And also it's hard because your mindset being in the U.S., like you said, like we're so far advanced in terms of, let's just say, consumer culture, right? You hop on your phone, you can order something on Amazon and it's delivered there the same day. Like that's unbelievable.
Yeah, and by the way, there's no Amazon there. There's no Uber.
Nothing.
There's no Deliveroo or food arriving on your doorstep. It's old school.
It's old school. It's old school. So what was going through your mind, right? You planned this whole trip down there. You kind of had an understanding of what was going on. So first night, we're meeting everybody at this beautiful Colonia Hotel, Cara Lodge there. Really nice, having a dinner. What was going on? What was kind of your biggest takeaways from the first night?
Yeah, so we hosted a dinner, and people flew in from all over the U.S. and some people from Europe and a couple others from Latin America, all curious.
Yeah.
And we met with, as you said, one of the major executives from ExxonMobil, a representative from the U.S. Consulate or the embassy, as well as several Guyanese government representatives and just local entrepreneurs. And I was very focused on the oil, but the more that everyone spoke, it became very obvious that they need help. Really, they truly do. And this was not a society or economy that's necessarily protected. I've been to other places where it's almost like a scarcity model. Like, for example, if you've been to like the surfer villages in Costa Rica or somewhere else somewhere, and you go there and there's opening a new restaurant. This is going to threaten my other restaurant. Or it's the opposite there. It's the complete opposite. So speaking to these people and having this mindset on the oil and then realizing, wait, no, the big opportunity here is outside of oil, supporting these people and actually working with them, going to Exxon, going to the U.S. Embassy, going to the Guyanese government and saying, what do you guys need? Like, how can we help you? And the Guyanese government is literally ready to write checks to people that want to do that. They have multiple different organizations and associations that have bids out that say, hey, we need this built, we need this imported, we need this taken care of. And it's very clear what they need. And you go talk to them and they say, hey, we have funding. We can do this. We just need people to get here and get it done.
Because the value, and that I think is one of the challenges, is the value proposition to move someone down there it's not great, right? So if you're trying to attract a U.S. or a foreign expat down to Guyana, right? We talked a little bit about the sketch factor, about the heat. It's hot down there. It's like the climate is intense. There's bugs, lots of things. So the carrot, they're trying to, like, if you think about it from the perspective of a large corporation, they need to continue to increase the carrots to bring people down there.
For sure. And that's going to be the growing pains part. And we're going to find out how that unfolds in the coming years.
Yeah.
But it's almost exactly like the Middle East. I mean, Dubai, it's a desert. It's hot there.
Exactly.
Very hot. Resources other than oil is tough. It's not like they have a huge, freshwater spring there. They had to build all kinds of infrastructure there. And Guyana's no different than that, other than I think the people capital is the main thing that they're missing right now. Is how
and Saudi was missing it as well, right? They had to bring in people, but again, the things we learned that first dinner. One of the things that's interesting. You mentioned that the government is supportive.
Mm-hmm.
They have, from what I gathered, kind of like a don't ask, don't tell policy around bringing in labor, right? So I talked to one of the executives who's like, let's say you're a Chinese construction company and you want to bring in 100 Chinese workers, they're effectively just rubber stamping. It's because they don't have the people there to get the work done, and they know they need to get the work done, which is very interesting. That, like you said, it's not a scarcity mindset around that.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
And in fact, that's a good point, because when we came in through the airport, I have a U.S. passport.
Yeah.
Most countries is pretty easy, but it was like easier to get into Guyana than it is to get back into the U.S.
Oh, for sure.
They just stamp a passport, get in here.
Yeah.
Like we don't even really care who you are, as long as you can fog a mirror. Like, come on in.
You fog a mirror. Yeah.
No, but it's true though.
Yeah.
They need that human capital,
Yeah.
and again, for an investor, an entrepreneur who's listening to this and thinking, how do I get involved here? It's a direct flight from the U.S.
Yes.
They speak English. They are literally listing what they need done. They have the money to pay for it.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of like, twiddling their thumbs, like, all right, like, come on, people, let's do this.
Come on.
And to be fair, also to the Guyanese government, they've been so underdeveloped for years. They're taking this quantum leap. So, for example, their RFPs, their requests for proposals, I mean, it's like typed out on a piece of paper. They don't have some sophisticated online system where you can upload your resume and all that type of stuff. You need to go down there and talk to them. You need to actually sit down, have a cup of coffee, talk to these people. And that's Latin American culture in general too. Is it's very important to get to know somebody, spend the time, shake hands, speak with them, and they're very much about that. Very, very nice people. Actually, I would say like one of the nicest people I've met.
Incredibly friendly.
Yeah, and so I think for, again, someone listening, that opportunity, I feel like we're early, but I think we're even earlier than early. It's like
for sure
ridiculously early, and you could go down there. That was the other thing. We noticed that we got networked like that. We met one person. They're like, hey, and WhatsApp is how you communicate everywhere. Get this person's number, and in 2 days we knew like 40 different people that were serious movers and shakers. And anybody can go down there and make that happen as well.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're serious.
For sure. I mean,
right? Like, I think the main reason that happened was that there's serious people that are brought down. So it made sense. Like, once you break, like anything, once you get into past the initial gatekeeping, then things open up, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're wandering around the streets, for sure you're just going to wander. But if you have a specific skill or trade that you're knowledgeable in, send us a couple emails, get some connections, go down there, and then just say, hey, I can do this. I know how to build homes, or I know how to build bridges, or whatever it is. And you're going to get connected very quickly.
For sure, because there's demand. There's demand. So, okay, we go through. We have this great, interesting night. Things open up. And then the next day, we have a trip out to a shrimp farm. About, what was that?
Too long.
I mean,
it was an hour drive that took 3.5 hours.
An hour that took 3.5 hours. And I think the second, one of the next realizations as that we committed to go out to this freshwater shrimp farm that was supposed to be an hour away, ends up being 3.5 hours. It is burning hot the entire time. Like, the van was hot. And it was very typical. Like, it felt like in other places that I've been where it's just one lane, you're just hitting potholes and you're cruising slow because there's traffic. And quickly realized it's like infrastructure, building roads. They're going to be building roads for a decade, and it's still not going to be enough, right? There's one bridge to cross over, and that bridge gets shut down for half the day. Well, basically the way that it works is they use 2 lanes going in to the city in the morning and 2 lanes going out of the city. So if you're caught on the other side of the river in the afternoon when it shifts, you can't get back into the city for I think 6 hours or something like that. So you're completely out of luck. So we go all the way over there, and this is the main road out to this shrimp farm, and it's like just passing people, you're like, it's like that nice on the edge of, are we going to hit somebody every time you pass around someone? Finally get out to the shrimp farm, take a look at it, and yeah, tell me what were your expectations versus reality shrimp farm?
I will say, I'll add one thing about the drive is the
Yeah.
bridge is really interesting. And for anyone listening who's interested in this infrastructure type stuff, their bridge is a floating bridge. So it was probably 40 or 50 barges that they had tied together
Yeah.
across this river. It was an incredible infrastructure project that was temporary. It looked like the Army Corps of Engineers came in and did it or something. But that was a bridge. It wasn't an actual bridge. It was a floating bridge. You could see the road flexing while you were driving.
Totally. And boats can't get through.
Yep.
So they have to break it apart to let the boats
Yeah.
get in and out.
Yeah. So you could just tell like this is not sustainable, but what's coming next is going to be massive. So we get out to the shrimp farm. It's hot out there. The one thing I remember from the shrimp farm is kind of a side story. Yeah, I was like, what is that smell? That horrible smell. It was like a rotting corpse or something. It was horrendous. And the guy at the shrimp farm was like, oh, yeah, that's an anaconda out there. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, anacondas stink. I had no idea anacondas stunk, but I just remember that. So I just like, okay, I don't not want to walk into
He was like, don't go over there. That's usually where the anaconda stays.
Yeah, that's where the 30-foot man-eater is. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go over there. But we went out
Which
there.
also is funny because I thought back, I'm like, he could totally have just been like messing with us.
Totally.
And there's just no way we would have known.
No. But this is the land. We'll get to it in a little bit, but this country is extremely resource rich, not only in minerals and oil and all that, but with wildlife. So if someone's like, there's a man eater out there, there's like Chewbacca or the Yeti, I'm like, all right, there's a Sasquatch out there.
Yeah.
Like, I believe you. So we get out to the shrimp farm, and the one thing that was, my first takeaway is, when you look on a map, you're like, oh, I drove for 3 hours. It must be an inch or something. It was one of those circumstances where I look at the map and I'm like, oh yeah, we must be down here.
No.
And then I realized like we had not even covered a fraction of the country.
Totally.
So the interior of the country they call the hinterland, and that's the interior of the country. It's essentially pure, pristine, undisturbed jungle. And we had driven this long 3 hours through, like you said, this maze of people and roads and potholes, and just realized that we just hadn't even gone anywhere.
The surface.
Hadn't even gone
of the
anywhere.
country. Yeah.
Yep. But other things I realized out there is just, again, extremely undeveloped. I wouldn't say there was an extreme amount of poverty there. There's homes there, people seeing it seems safe, and there's transportation, there's food and all that stuff, but it's not like there's skyscrapers everywhere, but there's construction all over the place. Of course, to support the oil industry, but you can just tell that the country is just bursting, ready to be developed.
Totally. And I think when I was there and we started to get a taste of, okay, we at the point where with a shrimp farm it was kind of at the edge of the road, and you could tell it was right at
the riverbank.
Right. Yeah. Right at the bank, right at the edge of the Essequibo.
Mm-hmm.
And Essequibo River is the largest river in Guyana. It's also the line. It goes deep into all the way up into the rainforest. It's also the line that is disputed with Venezuela. And so the Essequibo region is the region that Venezuela has technically claimed and said, hey, that this is the area that we think is actually in Venezuela. Guyana's like, no, it's in Guyana because it has been in Guyana. Venezuela makes this claim after Guyana discovers one of the largest oil discoveries in history. And we'll go into why, what we learned about that specifically. But my realization when I was at the shrimp farm is the beauty of this country and what is spectacular about it is in the hinterlands. Mm-hmm. There's a clip of a BBC journalist, the hard talk journalist, I can't remember his name, interviewing the president of Guyana. It was probably the most viral clip around Guyana in the last 6 months, maybe even a couple years. And he's talking to this hard talk BBC journalist, kind of looks down over his glasses and kind of lecturing the president about them pumping out this oil. It's like, what gives you the right to pump out all this oil, knowing how it's going to impact climate change? And it goes viral. We'll play the clip. It goes viral because the president just reads him his rights about about how
he eviscerates him.
eviscerates him.
He shuts him down and basically says, our pristine jungle consumes more carbon
than anywhere else in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the reality that what I realized when I was at that shrimp farm, you're like, okay, we're scratching the surface of this country. Everything is in the jungle. And the challenge, one of the reasons why it is so pristine and untouched, again, there's still uncontacted tribes in Guyana. That's where we're at. Uncontacted tribes. Now, the reason you can't get in there except by plane. That's like one of the there's no roads. Like if you want to get in there, you're going to have to take a plane.
And not only that, the helicopters, we looked into helicopters to go out into the jungle. None of them will go out there because there's nowhere safe to land if there's an emergency. And the jungle's so thick for so far, they're not going to go out there and hover. They need to come back. So there's this vast portion of the jungle that's just essentially inaccessible unless you want to, machete through the jungle for days. And then you're fighting jaguars and man-eating anacondas and Sasquatches. So.
Exactly. So that was kind of like, it started to, on this trip, connect for me. That was like, oh, what really is becoming an interesting opportunity is the rainforest and this incredibly unique place that is full of rivers, it's full of water, it's full of jungle, and it's 4.5 hours away from Miami, right? So if you're thinking about going down to like the Amazon type region, well, it's 4.5 hours from Miami. You land, and guess what? We learned we were down there, something we didn't know when we got there, that the president was the former minister of tourism, and one of his biggest priorities is to figure out how to put Guyana on the map as a tourist destination for people in North America.
And one quick statistic, Guyana receives the same amount of ecotourism guests in 1 year as Machu Picchu does in 1 day. So to put that into context, basically no one's even going out.
No one's going there.
It's completely untouched. If you're out there exploring, you're solo with a guide, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a big realization. That was a big realization for me, and something that I've started to continue to dive down into and be like, okay, where are the opportunities here? Because it's back to what Cody was saying. It's like the government wants to write checks. They want to support this. It's got incredible natural resources, and they're building some infrastructure projects that I think you can talk about a little bit more. So why don't you talk about like the hinterland, what you learned, the road project, and give some context about this. So
if you think of the U.S. back in the early 20th century, one of the big works projects, I think it was by Eisenhower, was to build the roads, the interstate system in the U.S. And that obviously enabled commerce to proliferate, but it was also just a way for people to get from point A to point B. And without that interstate system, the U.S. probably would not have developed as rapidly as it has over the past several decades. And many countries have copied that model because it makes sense. It's just like you look at arteries, in your body. The more blood can go through your body, the more things are going to flow. So one of the major projects that Guyana needs to develop is this road to the interior of the country. There currently is a road, but this road is more or less a dirt track. Not only that, there's several big river crossings that require these, it's basically a barge with a little tugboat. When I say tugboat, it's like an inflatable raft with a little outboard engine pulling this barge across with 4 Jeeps on the barge. And so the ability to transport people is very difficult. And then you throw in, hey, I'm going to transport crops or livestock. It's impossible.
Yeah.
And a quick note on the rivers here. We mentioned the Essequibo River earlier. This isn't like a clear water, throw a baseball across the river.
No, it's a monster.
It's monster. Like you can barely see the horizon on the other side. It's like muddy, gnarly water. There's like massive boats.
There's actually like, it almost looks like an ocean because there's so much current ripping through there.
Right. So the idea of simply building a road here or there to cross the river, this is a challenge for them. So anyways, back to this road. They're building this road. It's already under construction. It's already funded. This is happening. It's going into the hinterland, which is basically the inland of the country, interior of the country. Historically, there was a ranch there. They call it the Dadawana, I think. And I probably just butchered that, so we should go back and change that. But it was the largest ranch in the world during the 1800s, and it held thousands of heads of cattle, and it was this huge area where they had grazing lands. They also had a lot of farmlands, but it was extremely isolated. So this ranch over years kind of went away just because it was so hard to export a lot of the livestock from there. But with this new road that they're building, this essentially unlocks a huge part of the country that is extremely fertile, that is prime livestock raising area, and they're the border of Brazil. And Brazil has a city called Boa Vista, which is right next to the Guyanese border. Huge agriculture land. Brazil has mostly been exporting that agriculture to the coastline of Brazil, which is this, if you look at a map, it's this huge wraparound, long transport time. If Guyana gets this road built, it creates a way for Brazil to export all this agriculture to the Atlantic Ocean within a day. So this infrastructure project, which will ultimately be funded by the oil money that's coming in, is going to unlock this whole other part of the country to agriculture, livestock, ecotourism, and transportation for the country. So this is good for everybody in general, but especially for the people of Guyana. It's going to enable them to use their land much more efficiently, get around, get access to healthcare, education, all these types of things that we take for granted. They can't do because they have this road that takes them, 10 hours for a distance that would take us a half hour, an hour in the U.S.
Totally.
So that's one of the big infrastructure projects they're doing.
Well, and also I think it's important to give context. So we were talking about the jungle, right? The jungle is a big part of the country. And then there's the savannah, right? And that's the part that Cody's talking about. There it's effectively very fertile farmland type area that goes into Brazil. And so as we've discovered more about the country and you start to learn more about how it's broken down, it's like the northern part of the country, northwestern part is like all jungle, and then kind of as it goes a little bit towards the southern part, it becomes more of a savanna and completely different climate. It's cooler. There's different things to see, and there's also interesting kind of like tourism things that are different than just being in the jungle.
Yeah, I mean, they have, for example, they have exotic animals. They have anteaters and
giant anteaters.
Giant anteaters. They have jaguars. They have all these and 800 species of rare birds that don't exist anywhere in the world. And for someone in the U.S., I always think of an exotic animal experience as going to Africa, going and doing a safari.
Yeah.
But going to Africa from the U.S. is an enormous trek, extremely expensive, but also it's like most people can't do that. It's
20 hours.
Yeah, but also you get there, it's a couple weeks. I can't take that out of my life.
Yeah.
You got this 4.5 direct hour flight from the U.S. Bing, bang, boom. I'm in this like exotic land with crazy animals, and
you can literally go see jaguars. That's
yeah.
one of the best places in the world to see jaguars.
Yeah, it's the actual.
And also to your point about this road, one of the stated goals of the Guyanese government is to build and to improve their port so that it can become more of a shipping hub in Latin America. And so it matches almost exactly what you're saying, from shipping from Brazil all the way out to this port they're building and continuing to expand with trade. So in this area, right, like what are your biggest takeaways as far as, like, let's just say you're somebody living in North America and or South America and wants to get involved? Like what are the tourism plays that you see?
Yeah, I think first of all, there's take the investor hat off, like go be a tourist, go check this out.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's inexpensive. It's close by. It's literally once in a lifetime, different planet type experience. So that's, I think, the first thing.
Yeah. I mean, just you want to get in a perspective, go watch the show River Monsters. Mm-hmm. Look at the episode in Guyana and see some of the stuff that he's pulling out of the river. Unbelievable. Like there's tigerfish there, crazy animals. Like the show is River Monsters. They have true river monsters still in Guyana.
Yeah. And anacondas.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd be a tourist. I think secondarily, the tourism industry is just so ripe. I don't want to say for disruption, because it doesn't even need to be disrupted. It just needs to be developed. And one of the simplest ways to do that is, you could probably create a website in the U.S. just to articulate how to actually get to Guyana to make this all happen. Like, here, fly to here, get to this hotel,
Yeah.
contact this guy, go to the airplane. Because as of right now, it's very difficult to do that, very hard. We figured it out for ourselves. So if somebody could string that together, it would be incredible. But as far as on the ground, again, the transportation thing is a big one. I think it just was a recurring theme for us.
Totally.
Getting a taxi, it wasn't super difficult, but it wasn't Uber, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't very clear about how to get from one place to another. To get into the interior of the land was very difficult. Private flights, we did find some flights that go into the interior, but still it's one of those things where you got to show up to the airport. They don't have an online system. You're like, hey, do you have any seats today? And they're like, oh, no, come back tomorrow. You come back tomorrow. Oh, sorry, this is like, you know, our plane had a flat tire. You're like, okay, I'm going to come back tomorrow. It's just very, you know, just old school way of doing things. So that's the transportation. And then once you are there is the residences or the hotels or the lodges or anything you want to actually host people with, also very underdeveloped. There are some things there, but it's much more for the extreme, say, bird watcher that was there in maybe the 90s, though maybe very, very, we're talking like a handful of people that have ever been that region.
Totally.
But again, there's enormous amounts of land there and people in Guyana that say, hey, we're ready. Bring them in. Bring in the tourists. We want to make some money and show them what we got.
I also see there's lots of expats that are going to be down there that need something to do, right? They're expats that are going down there getting paid a lot of money to be down there, right? They have to be. They're going to be in, it's just like they've got these large corporations that are making a lot of money, that are paying them a lot of money to be down there. And there's not much for them to do currently in Guyana. They're not going to go to Venezuela. Say they're Americans in the oil industry. They're not going to Venezuela. They're not really going to Suriname, which is next to it. They might go to Brazil, right? But just the weekend trips, there's opportunities there.
And the local Guyanese people.
And local
Remember,
Guyanese
they went
people.
from $10,000 a year to $40,000 a year. There's only so many.
And they're going to go from 40,000 to 80,000.
Yeah, and there's only so much food you can buy and clothes. Like, they're going to start to do things and within their country, and I'm sure they're going to be proud of it. So what better way to tour your own country? And so that whole ecotourism world is
very interesting.
Very interesting, and the sky's the limit there. And again, I wouldn't even say it needs to be disrupted; it just needs to be built.
Totally.
And it's any which way. It could be luxury, it could be basic, it could be creative, it could be simple. Just all of it needs to be built there.
Totally. So I want to go into service, talk a little bit like that, and then talk also about the downside, right? The risks a little bit. We've alluded to Venezuela and what's going on there, but the first is get into. So you mentioned local people making a lot more money. Where do they spend it? And I mean, I thought one of my observations, we went out the last night to an awesome rooftop, really nice restaurant. It's one of those experiences that you have in places like, I've had this all over the world, where I'm sitting there in Guyana, in Georgetown, at this beautiful restaurant. I'm like, this restaurant could be anywhere, like straight up. Any type of drink that you want, great food, rooftop, music. It was absolutely packed with local Guyanese. And in my head, I'm like, there's one of these, right? There could be 5 of these. If you want to build a nice restaurant, any sort of restaurant type service industry, they're ripe for it.
Absolutely. So I won't retell the story you just told, but I would just reiterate that. That is probably the number one thing is a service in the service industry is the nightlife. There was lots of cool places we went to, but they were all, I shouldn't say lots. There was several places we went to, and that was it. That was it.
Yeah.
But they were all packed.
Exactly.
And mostly with Guyanese.
Yeah.
And they were spending money, like real US dollar money.
And it was expensive.
Yeah.
It was, again, the dinner was like, are we in Los Angeles? Mm-hmm. Right? What are these prices here? We're in Guyana.
Yep.
The prices are absurd because there's limited supply.
Yeah, and I'm sure the prices, just to be clear, was we were at a nice place.
Yes.
And they could charge high prices.
Because of supply.
Like LA, New York prices.
Yeah.
But if you went to, I don't know, some other like local shop, it's going to
be less expensive,
but
for sure.
It was very, very noticeable that there's this desire from the local Guyanese people that, hey, we have this new wealth. We want to have fun. We want to reward ourselves for our country that's developing, and
Yeah.
we're ready to do this. So yeah, the service industry, I would say the restaurant and bar scene for sure. I also say we had this place, we went to breakfast every morning. It was great food. Same story again. Expensive. It was kind of I wouldn't say hipster cafe, but it was a Guyanese version of a hipster
Cody's
cafe.
in Austin. He's having his hipster experience.
Yeah, I'm like allergic to hipsters, even though like I might look like one. So it's kind of ironic. But in Guyana, the one place we went to for breakfast, it was great food, but it was expensive.
Yeah.
And it was packed to the brim every
day.
single morning.
Yeah.
So for somebody from wherever you're from, Africa, Europe, Asia, the U.S., somewhere else in Latin America, like you could go there and just open a simple like cafe.
Good quality food.
Like it doesn't even not even a huge capital expense, just
No.
something like small and simple. People are dying to buy that type of service.
Totally.
Because it makes you feel like, oh, this country's developing. I'm making some money. I'm going to go get a coffee in the morning. I'm going to get a nice sandwich in the afternoon.
Totally.
And that's a very, very slim market right now. That's it's going to boom.
Totally. Let's talk about the downside.
Yeah.
Right. So we talked about Venezuela. What do you see? What are the biggest risks?
So there is something that's happened in history with multiple countries called the resource curse. And that's essentially if your country has a lot of resources, there's going to be all these vultures that come in, pick apart your country, steal the money. It's corrupt. There's all kinds of horrible things that happen. And
The money just goes to the people in power, not the people that are in the population.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is unfortunate to say, but it's probably less than 1% of the time. Maybe not that bad. It's the statistics are bad for countries that pull this off really
Totally.
well. Africa is probably the best example of this gone wrong, which is, hey, you have a country that's really rich in some sort of rare earth mineral or metal, whether it's lithium, copper, gold, manganese, platinum, whatever. You have this major corporation go in there, shred apart the land, extract everything. The money doesn't get reinvested into the local economy. It gets shipped overseas, and the locals get screwed over.
Totally.
So I just painted a pretty sour picture. And that's, again, happened all over the world.
And that's one.
That's one.
The other challenge is that Venezuela has voted through a referendum to annex the Essequibo region,
Yeah,
which is
so-
what we talked about. This river, on the other side of the river, there's this massive jungle, and they say they've literally passed a referendum to invade Guyana.
Yeah. And just to give a little bit of context to that, so there's been a dispute about this land area. And to be clear, it's 2/3 of Guyana. It's the western, let's say 2/3 of Guyana that's divided by this river that Venezuela has said for 100 years, like, that's our land. And Guyana's like, no, that's our land. So it's been this ongoing dispute.
Totally.
However, about 100 years ago, the international court said, hey, no, this is Guyana's land. But it hasn't ever really been solved, and no one's really made a stink about it.
And then when the oil came,
Yeah, when the oil came, Venezuela said, actually, you know what, guys, this is our land again. And recently, within the past couple months, Venezuela's been getting louder and louder about it. As you mentioned, they passed a referendum that was overwhelmingly voted.
totally.
Although it's tough to believe anything that's voted for in Venezuela. But hey, who knows? Maybe it really was a legit.
But and that was one again. Coming in, I was like, "What's like?" The first thing I thought when I read about this was, "Well, let's research. Like, what is the reality? Should I go down there?
Yeah, is Venezuela going to invade? Are we going to get killed? Like, is there going to be a war?
Is there going to be a war when we're down there?" Well, it turns out, like very quickly after doing some research, you start to realize that in many ways, this referendum, it's more for like public sentiment than anything else. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Venezuela's got its own problems inside, and Maduro's got some issues that he's struggling with, and having this distraction of patriotic Venezuelan, hey, let's retake our land, is a really good way to get some support for him and his reelection that's coming up, even though I don't think he's too concerned with if he's going to get reelected or not. But it certainly helps to distract his population from a lot of issues going on there. But nonetheless, it is a real problem. It is something that's disputed over. But as you said, when we got there, the Guyanese almost made a joke of it. They're
Totally.
like, "Oh yeah, have you been over to our Venezuela County or whatever they called it?"
Yeah, exactly.
But it's clearly Guyana. The Guyanese live there, and they're making a joke that like, "Hey, we're living in Venezuela because Venezuela said it's our land."
But the reality is, Venezuela, even if they wanted to invade, they really couldn't
No.
because it would be rolling tanks, if they have tanks, I'm not sure how many tanks they've got, into the most dense jungle in the entire world with no roads.
No roads, and there's nobody there. So
And
you're
there's
like
no one
taking
there.
over land that there's not even really a thing to
You
take
would be
over.
just fighting and chopping your way
You'd
through
be
the
fighting
jungle.
anacondas.
Exactly.
And Sasquatch.
Exactly.
And you don't want to fight those people.
You don't want to fight those at all. And not only that, the only road goes through Brazil, and Brazil put their troops right on the border and said, we're not into it.
Yep.
And the British initially had an aircraft carrier that cruised by, and then the U.S. sent an aircraft carrier that cruised by. They've been doing some flyover exercises. There's a lot, given the fact that Exxon owns the majority of the rights, and Chevron is in a dispute to buy the other big chunk of the rights. The U.S. is highly involved.
Yeah, and to dive into that a little bit, the U.S. sent Anthony Blinken down there back in 2023. A month after that, they sent the Southern Command General down there of the U.S. military. And this is clearly a statement to Venezuela saying, hey, the U.S. isn't messing around. We're going to defend Guyana if Venezuela messes with Guyana. But it was also an interesting move for the U.S. because of the energy security
Totally.
in the region. And so ExxonMobil is one of the largest publicly traded companies in the world, and it's one of the most important companies in the U.S. And they really are too big to fail. The U.S. government will not let ExxonMobil fail. And Guyana will be the number one region for ExxonMobil when it comes to the amount of oil that they're producing. It will become the number one region. And the U.S. is going to ensure that not only Exxon's rights are withheld with the Guyanese government, but they're also protected from any other nations such as Venezuela. But bigger picture, it's also a security issue for the U.S. As the Middle East deteriorates with their security with oil, the U.S. is looking for oil. The U.S. right now is the largest exporter of oil and producer of oil, with I think 13 million barrels a day right now, which is incredible. But they need more. The U.S. needs more. And this region is very close to the U.S., much easier than shipping oil from the Middle East.
Much easier.
Much more.
The oil is actually high quality too. Yeah.
It needs less refinery.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's right there. It's in the Americas. And it's with an English-speaking country that we're in very good terms with. So there will be much more to this part of the story, and I'm hesitant to make too many forecasts about what will happen there. But that's a huge part of the story that an investor entrepreneur needs to think about, or adventure when you're going there. Like, what's going to happen with this country? Is there corruption there? Yeah, there's corruption there. There's things going on. Is it developing? There's going to be some growing pains. But what's the long-term play here?
Yeah.
Where is Guyana going to fall? And for the most part, Guyana said, hey, we're not aligning ourselves with OPEC. We're not aligning ourselves with the Russians or the Chinese, or even necessarily the U.S. We're kind of playing neutral here.
Yeah.
But we're very much, Western-oriented. So again, if you're an investor, like that matters. I want to make sure I'm investing in a location that's going to be safe and that has the support of nations that are abiding by law. And if you're thinking about going there, that's obviously feels better for safety wise. But if you're thinking of spending time and your capital there, that's super important as well.
Totally. We're going to talk more about Guyana. This is like an intro episode. We went through a ton, but again, this episode, this is the kickoff to this podcast. We're having fun. It's an experiment. We want to learn. We want to hear from you. We want to hear, what did you think about this episode? We would love for you to subscribe, because that's going to help us grow. And yeah, we're going to keep putting out episodes, keep figuring out exactly what we are doing here. But hope you enjoyed it. And thanks for joining us on this first inaugural episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. We'll see you guys on the next episode.